Good afternoon and welcome to today's session. I'm David Anthony and I'll be delivering this month's Lunch and Learn. I can see people are joining us from the attendee list. If you have joined us, please do put your name in the chat. Tell us where you're listening from. You can also use the chat to comment and ask questions throughout the session today. It will be really interesting to hear what's brought you to the presentation today as well. So if you're a professional or maybe a parent, and I do recognize some of the names in the attendee list, and I do know we've got some parents here today, so it'd be great to use the chat and just introduce yourself to the rest of the people listening to today. The session is being recorded and you will get a link afterwards to be able to watch it back. Today's topic is absolutely huge. So I'm going to try and touch on a few areas which, if you are a professional, you should be aware of, and supporting parents through those type of ideas or concepts. And if you are a parent of a young person approaching adulthood or already as an adult, these might be things that you're not aware of or are looking for some more information on. But the whole session today is about this idea of this cliff edge at the end of education, going into adulthood, and the challenges which that brings to our young people, but also the family unit, the wider professionals, and actually what happens next after education. My name's, like I say, David Anthony. I've been at Beyond Autism since 2015. I'm currently the head of our research and learning department. And my main focus at the moment is looking outwards from the organisation, so working with partner schools and local authorities to support young people in their placement, with a real focus on reducing school placement breakdown and barriers to education. I've been the head of an adult provision for Beyond Autism, and a lot of the learning, which I'm going to share with you today, actually comes from that time working in that adult provision of ours. So I'm going to take you through today. The areas of what I'd like to look at with you is why being an adult isn't actually all that bad. There's lots of reasons and things which do annoy us about being an adult, which we have responsibilities and so forth, but actually there's a lot of good things which come with being an adult. I'll talk a little bit about the cliff edge and why that exists and why there is such a jump from education to adult services. And then the body of today, in the short time we have, I'd really like to focus on some of the strategies or things we can do to think about reducing that cliff edge and really empowering our learners to have some choice control and opportunities as they leave education and go into adulthood. We have Anna in the background today who's moderating the chat. So if you've got questions, do feel free to put them in the chat box. Anna will be able to assist in making sure they get through to me. And if we have time today, we'll certainly answer them at the end of the session. So this idea of why being an adult is actually a good thing. And I did some research, like why is being an adult so great? And actually, Suzanne here came up with several reasons. And this first one, this idea that you get to choose your own pants. And actually, when you think about that, it's this idea that you're going to be independent. You make independent choices and decisions about what you want to do as an adult. And actually, the education leading up to being an adult is all building around that option of having choice, but also being able to communicate choice. And a lot of the young people we're going to be thinking about in this session are those learners with the most barriers or high levels of need in their life. So actually being able to choose your own pants is quite a cool thing to be able to do as an adult. This idea that you have the ability to change your circumstances. You have opportunities as an adult which you don't have as a child. You're within certain structures as a child. Parents, family have heavily influence over you as a child, but obviously as an adult, you have that freedom to make changes and choices that you want to make for yourself. And I've called that opportunities. You can choose your own network, friendships and relationships. And a lot of these things I know there's lots of barriers to lots of these things, and having those opportunities and the skills to make relationships and friendships. But adulthood gives us the opportunity to have a lot more choice and control over who we hang out with, who we spend time with going forward. You can have chocolate cake for breakfast. So this is very much about choice making. Now, I think almost all of us, I'm sure, think this is probably not a sensible choice to have a chocolate cake for breakfast. And we're actually going to talk a little bit about some of the implications of choice making as an adult with additional needs, or quite significant barriers. But that is one of the benefits of being an adult. You get to choose what you have for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You make the choices for yourself. Whether they're sensible or not, we'll come to. You have experience on your side, and there's lots and lots of quotes about learning in school, but learning is essentially what is stuck when you've left education. What skills and knowledge and experiences have you taken with you to make adulthood a place where you're making informed choices and you carry all that experience with you? So taking all those things together, actually being an adult isn't so bad. It's not all doom and gloom. It's not all bills and responsibilities, but actually there's a lot of freedom and choice. And there are lots of challenges too. But this idea of the cliff edge is very much about education coming to an end, and then entering adulthood services, resources, experiences, networks. And actually, this time is difficult for any young person. It's not just people with significant barriers or additional needs or disabilities. And I think if any of us look back over what our education was like and this period of time, it's a mixture of excitement, maybe apprehension, what am I going to do with my life, worrying about making mistakes when we go forward. And that cliff edge is just really amplified if you're a person with additional needs, because often the school services which our young people engage in are seen as an oasis. And that's directly from a parent I've worked with previously. They describe school as an oasis where all their needs are met, and it's a bubble where that person is safe and secure and supported by people who understand them, and they have access to the things they love. If you're in our post-19 service, the ideal week, engaging in activities you want to do as a young person. With adult services slowly being introduced, often that oasis starts to change and it's going to look different. And that can be quite scary and quite a period of time of change, and not just for that young person, but also for adults. Why does that cliff edge exist? And like I say, every young person growing into becoming an adult will have their own experience of growing up. However, there's several reasons why this change is more specifically challenging for this group of people. And the first one, it is a significant change. Often when learners find a school that they're comfortable in, they stay there for long periods of their life, maybe 5 or 6, 7 years of their life. And actually, this is a huge, significant change. And what we know about people with additional needs is structure, routine is actually comforting for many of them. And lots of those scaffoldings and structures will change as a young person enters adulthood. And there's lots of things we can do to prepare them for that. And we're going to look at some of those things. But that significant change can't be underestimated. And whenever you're thinking about transition to adulthood, think about your own experiences and how many changes you went through as a person. Diagnosis, when we're talking about additional needs, is a huge influencing factor on young people. If you have a late diagnosis, or your diagnosis changes, or you get additional diagnosis, that's going to alter your path maybe, or your access to resources. But also people who are diagnosed later often have had less opportunities to build the strategies needed for their specific needs and what they need personally. We know, it's International Women's Day today. There's lots of information around the internet today about autism and women. And particularly females being diagnosed later in their education. That's going to impact what their transition to adulthood is going to look like. Funding structures are significantly different in adult social care and provisions, and actually not having the information or understanding how a child or young person moves from an EHCP to adult services. And you'll often find schools and educational professionals are very much aware of just the EHCP structure or SEND support structures and don't have a lot of information on adult services. So that can be a real challenge, and a reason for the cliff edge is the schools not feeling confident in guiding parents and families on what's available when they leave school. Provision, and we talked a little bit about the OASIS, but provision's a really important part of this, and education provision is extremely standardized. And adult life isn't. You know, we have our work and our work schedule, but actually what we choose to do in the evening or the weekend or on our days off will look very different, and we decide when we take annual leave and so forth. But as a young person becoming an adult, they will often lose that structure of the school day, and actually provision will look very, very different. And provision will be very much based on what that individual's aspirations are, what they want to do, what their interests are, but also vocation, and we'll come to vocational opportunities too. Geography plays a huge part. If you live in Devon or Dorset or Nottingham or London, the access to services is going to look very different. It's going to look incredibly different if you're in a city environment such as London compared to maybe North Wales. So where you live will influence the experience you have on leaving school and college and what's available to you and how far you have to travel for services. The big influence on the cliff edge is individual circumstances of families, and this was quite interesting coming out of the COVID pandemic, and quite worrying that such variations in people's situation exist at this time, and this increase around deprivation, disadvantaged young people living in poverty is going to have a huge influence on next steps going into adulthood. Finally, the cliff edge is also around knowledge and own lived experiences, what your journey as a parent or professional was like growing up, what access to resources you have as a parent, the network of professionals you have around you, and if you're a parent, who you have access to, other things such as English as additional language or second language, and parents or families having additional needs and disabilities as well, will all influence what that cliff edge looks like for that person entering adulthood. So there's lots and lots of pieces to the puzzle when we think about what looks next. Finally, is this idea of lifelong learning is not always a priority, and many annual reviews I've sat in over my career, and the conversations come to this idea that when they leave, or a young person leaves education, their learning stops. And actually, people with additional needs or barriers, lifelong learning has never been so important. Having those opportunities to carry on developing skills and not becoming stagnant in accepting that this is as many skills or knowledge as this person's going to have. None of us approach life like that. All of us are trying to better ourselves and educate ourselves further, I would think, or the majority of us. So lifelong learning not being a priority or not being considered within the structures and processes when we're considering leaving education. Now, the same structures might not be there to support lifelong learning, but it should always be a priority, particularly with those who have started at a different footing and not always had the same equal opportunities to access learning. So the first key area I'd like to touch on, so how do we overcome this cliff edge? And this one's going to sound pretty expected. I can't really talk about this subject without approaching this, but collect information and plan ahead. Planning is key to everything we have here, and information of key professionals in adult services at your local authority. You can't start too early in getting to know who works in different areas of the local authority in adult services. And I was on a call yesterday with a range of different alternative provisions. And one of the themes that came out of that was knowing who and when to contact and how to contact them. So even if provisions are having this issue, it's something that we should really focus on when we're planning ahead for our young people. So knowing who you need to speak to in local authorities. So social care, education, often there's transition coordinators, knowing who those are. And they might change, and we do know that staff retention across education services is an issue, but knowing who and how it's changing and keeping yourself informed is really, really key for planning. Getting to know what local provisions are available for adults with barriers and needs in your area. And, for the EHCP age group, so 0 to 25, we have the local offer, SEND local offer, and actually targeting some of the older provisions on the local offer, those who work with adults, and seeking their advice on what other provisions are available post 25 in your area or your local authorities which border where you are. And start making a list, getting to know those provisions, following them things on like Facebook, and just getting to know what they offer and what they do, what type of events and interests they provide people. Supported and independent living options. This is often, as a professional talking to families, this can be a really difficult conversation about approaching living opportunities and where this young person who's at the center of this plan is going to live. And it can be a really challenging conversation to have, and extremely challenging for parents as well. So starting this early and sowing the seeds in conversation, whether it's at an annual review, whether it's at a parents' evening, whether it's just an informal chat about what independent living options there are, what options are available to young people with additional needs generally, not with a view to saying that the young person's not going to live at home, but it's about informed choice. And it's about knowing what the options are for that young person as well, if they have capacity to choose where they want to live and how they want to live. And we're going to talk a little bit about mental capacity towards the end of the session. This is really, really key, understanding the benefit system and what government support is available for people with learning disabilities and other general barriers, and really understanding what support and benefits and money essentially is available to support into adulthood, particularly if that young person doesn't have a job and isn't bringing in an income of their own, and really, really using the government website. And we've got some links for you following today's talk. Two more things on that list is carer assessments. So starting as soon as possible, as early as year 9, year 10, starting to really understand what assessments are, how they might support you in assisting your young person going forward, and actually what help they might need going forward. And the care assessment, if you request it from your adult social worker, my understanding is they have to deliver or have that conversation with you. So care assessments are a real key part of that transition to adulthood. And finally, talk to your networks. When I worked in the post-19 service, so much of what I learned was through that network with parents, talking to parents about their experiences. A parent of a child who's 19, 20 with additional needs has a wealth of experience, lived experience, and often they've been through this transition and actually seeking advice from people and those parents really do hold on to a lot of information about what their experience was like, what their challenges were, and what they learned going forward. So steps to removing this cliff edge. So planning. This is just an extract from a code of practice, and I just wanted to pull this out because it does talk about ideally well before year 9. So these conversations about adulthood should be starting as early as possible. And that's because we need to be thinking about what skills and curriculum our learners need to be following in order to have the best possible opportunity in the future, to have the skills that they need. And if you're going to an annual review as a professional or as a parent, really highlighting this as a key topic for discussion, and not just tracking the outcomes of the HCP and getting bogged down in that, actually having those aspirational conversations going forward. I can see your questions come up about carers assessment. I'll pick up on that towards the end. So when we're thinking about planning, it's really important that we think about all 4 strands of that preparing for adulthood, and it's employability, community, independent living, health and well-being. And it's not about just focusing on one of those areas. They're all equally important, and each have their own skill set and area a child should be thinking about as they approach adulthood. Health and well-being, particularly an important one around how independent a young person is, about dignity, respect as a child becomes an adult, and respecting that as much as possible. We talked about independent living, but also community, and how big that community is. And obviously we've had huge impact in the last few years around COVID, and hindered actually a lot of the opportunities we've had to access the community generally. So I'm going to focus a little bit on employment, and I've actually written about this a little bit in the past, and I always use this list because it resonates so much with what we're trying to achieve with young people with additional needs. So the benefits of employment, this idea that work can be therapeutic. It can offer something that we can't get anywhere else. It's engaging in work can help promote recovery and rehabilitation. It can have that therapeutic element where going to a structured environment, knowing what you're doing, knowing who you're going to see, what you're going to do, can really have health benefits. And there we go. Work leads to better long-term health outcomes. Now, obviously, if a job is impacting someone's health and well-being, it's not going to have those long-term benefits. And we do have things like the employment toolkit available on the website, which really looks at reasonable adjustments and making sure that a job meets a young person's needs appropriately. So we can put that link in as well. Benefits to employment: minimizes the harmful physical, mental, and social effects of long-term sickness absence. This idea of getting back into the community, getting back involved with people, and back into routine. Again, this health and well-being aspect, risk of long-term incapacity. But I think this one resonates with me the most when I think about some of the indicators of autism. We think about social interaction, social communication. Employment has that opportunity to participate in society, engage in some independent level of activity. And actually, when we think about the barriers autistic people face, actually, this is a good opportunity for us to support those people in developing skills and communication, to be able to communicate, but also those employers and people understanding autism and breaking down prejudice around autism and communication particularly. And obviously the benefit of employment is financial, and the opportunity to have some social mobility and reduce poverty, and move forward, and improves quality of life and well-being. It's a really good article. It's quite an old one, about 2006, but it really does look at disability and work and why we want people to be able to access work. And we know the figures around autism are so poor. So when we're thinking about those outcomes and preparing for adulthood strands, I just wanted to put this graphic up to really emphasize that, yes, you're going to have your outcomes around, it might be social, emotional, mental health, physical and sensory in your EHCP or in your IEP, but really insist on talking about these 4 areas, at least from year 9 going forward. And many local authorities actually will have this part of their annual review paperwork and ask people to comment on those areas. And always making sure that we're being smart when we're setting outcomes around these areas. So making sure that they're bite-sized enough to be achieved in a year, but they're working to a larger aspirational outcome. Now, I'm really conscious of the time because I've been waffling on for so long now, 26 minutes or so. So I am going to go through the rest of the slides, but you can access them online after the presentation. Other steps around this cliff edge is person-centered planning, ensuring you know who the network is. There's 2 different examples here. So who's important to the young person on the left, on the right, who's the multidisciplinary or interdisciplinary team working with that person, and how does that change into adulthood, and what does that circle of professionals look like in adulthood, particularly around health. When we are also doing person-centered planning, there's 2 key elements, and the NDTI work a lot on preparing for adulthood, and they worked with the government on lots and lots of resources, and they've got some fantastic pieces around important 2 and important 4, and I really recommend you that you go check them out. But this idea that what a person values is what's important to them, but the important 4 are all the structures we're going to make that happen, and all of the resources, what's needed as we go into adulthood to really assist with that. A clear transition plan. On the website as well, we do actually have, I think, another lunch and learn just on transitions, but there's lots and lots of good resources out there about what a transition plan should look like, and these are some of the key areas. And in education we have things like profiles, how to support me plans, communication passports, and actually it's about making sure when a child or young person leaves school and leaves education, those go with them to their next setting and they're updated appropriately. So what I did want to touch on before we finish today is the Mental Capacity Act. And we talked about eating chocolate cake at the start of this presentation. And actually, I think majority of us would feel that eating chocolate cake for breakfast is probably not a good idea. And one of the conversations which often happens with parents is, if I left my child, they would eat all of the donuts, or they would eat the whole chocolate bar, or they would do X, Y, and Z, which isn't sensible. And the Mental Capacity Act really comes into place when we start thinking about that. And there's 5 principles there on screen. But that first one is presuming a person has capacity to make the decisions that they want to make. And each decision is decided on individually. We don't say someone has capacity or doesn't. It's based on individual decision making. There is an exception to that, and we'll look at that in a moment. But just because someone makes an unwise decision, it cannot be seen as just being a wrong decision because you don't agree with it. People need to be supported to have the right to make the decisions. So if we look at some of those ideas about how we support people to make decisions, inclusive communication, also known as total communication approach. So using pictures, resources, body language, words, and adapting to what that young person uses as their preferred communication method. And there we go, preferred communication method. If you know a person used PECS or sign, then their choice making should be facilitated in that way. Don't just meet with someone once to ask what their decision is, because how we feel on one day might not be how we feel on another. And if it's a really important decision, asking more than once on different times of day in their preferred location where they want to make the decision and talk about the decision, not what's convenient for you, but what's convenient for the person making that decision. Assistance from an advocate. We found advocates in the past to be a really good source of support, often quite impartial, and has the young person at the center of their support, and they're very much there for the person to advocate on their behalf. And we have some information again on the website about advocates and how to access that. If a person makes a continuous decision that puts them at risk, further investigation or support might be needed. And I think that goes back to this idea around the chocolate cake. And if a person had chocolate cake every single day for breakfast or excessively, and it was putting their health at risk, then that's where the capacity around that decision should start to be investigated and looked at, and deciding whether they actually truly understand the situation they're putting themselves in. And never assume that someone can't make a decision. Try all of the steps above and really empower someone to make a decision for themselves. Think about all the benefits of being an adult, all the joy we get from doing what we want to be able to do, and apply that to our young people. And use the network for people who know that young person the best in support to help facilitate that decision making. So the final element around mental capacity is deputyship. And this is usually a person who is over 18, a close relative or friend of a person who needs help in making decisions. So particularly as you're reaching 18, 19, deputyship is someone who is there to help the person who lacks capacity make decisions, who can't make decisions for themselves. And this is a person who's in their best interest. And this is a formal process. It's authorized by the Court of Protection. And actually schools and education partners should be able to support in the evidence around this and be able to support parents in thinking around deputyship going forward. There's two types of deputyship. One is around poverty and financial affairs, and one's around personal welfare. And those two are really quite different and really important for you to get your heads around if you are a parent. If you're a professional who has concerns about capacity of a young person going into adulthood, these are the sort of conversations you should be having with families and bringing this up to them. And on the government website, actually, Become a Deputy, that has really accessible information. It's really clear, it's really easy to understand, and actually explains it really, really well. So I'd recommend checking that out. Just as I said earlier, when you're researching local facilities, local partners, this is a really good one to check out and start to get knowledgeable about as you're going through the process towards becoming an adult. So some more information. We're going to finish. We've gone way over time. I'm really sorry. But like I said at the start, this topic is so huge, and actually 20 minutes, 25 minutes is probably not enough time to cover everything I want to say, and actually not in the full depth in which I want to say it. But what I wanted to do today is give you the hooks to go away today and really be able to research different areas, find out more information, have a starting point, particularly if your son or daughter, is in year 8, year 9, and thinking about what the future needs might be and the processes around that. On screen are a few tools and resources I've just pulled out. The NDTI is absolutely fantastic, like I said. The Beyond Autism Toolkit around employment. Council of Disabled Children also has a lot of resources, particularly around that carers assessment. I saw that there was a question about that. Council for Disabled Children has lots of information on that as well. Following today's presentation, there will be a blog post on the website. So what I've done there is I've linked all of these websites, all of these resources. So if you go to the blog afterwards, you'll be able to pick up all that information. We're not going to have time to answer the questions today, but what I'm going to do is ask Anna, who's in the background, to put those questions together, and I will reach out to you and try and answer them individually. But I just want to thank you, everyone who attended today. I really, really do appreciate it. It's such an important topic, and I really appreciate you coming today. If you would leave feedback after the presentation, an email will go out to you for a feedback form. Please do fill that in. I'd really love to know what you think, the good and the bad, and there's space in there to make comments as well. So I really, it really does inform what we do next. Our next session, though, is Autism, Women and Girls, and that's on Friday the 28th of April. That's with Hannah Smith. She has been working with autistic females around that session. So really do go and log your interest in that session and register. And do get in touch. My email address and details are on the website, and I do love to catch up with you. The recording and the slides are available afterwards. So do take care, and thank you so much for today.